On today's show, Parascak's junior dominance is over. Now he's got to prove it professionally.
Hey, this is Ryan Leonard from the Washington Capitals. Tune in to my favorite podcast, Locked On Capitals.
Your Locked On Capitals, your daily podcast on the Washington Capitals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Well, hello and welcome into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Dan Holmi. In today's episode, we talk about the Capitals' young, promising prospect that is Tarik Parisek. We talk about the contract, the summer training, and what I think a realistic first full pro season looks like for Parascak. A bit later, we'll talk about the 3 years in Prince George. Because, yeah, I think the numbers matter and everyone talks about it. I'm going to get into it. The 105 points to 82 points to 79 that I think it's worth talking about, but I don't think the numbers tell the full story. But where we will start in today's show is the 4 WHL games as a 16-year-old, then suddenly 105 points and a first-round pick. So the question really isn't whether Parascak can play hockey. We have seen evidence of that. The question for me is whether the hockey IQ can translate when the games get faster and everybody around him is bigger, stronger, and faster. And that's what we're going to try to figure out today. Let's get into it here. The draft profile of Tarik Parisek. That the brain, the hockey IQ is the attraction. And hockey IQ is a buzzword that I speak about in the show. It's a buzzword that you hear about in hockey circles. It seems particularly about younger players. I've spoke about it with Andrew Crystal. I've spoke about it with Cole Hudson in this episode about Tarik Parisek. That some players, the hockey IQ is their biggest strength, shall we say. It is even better if you have the skating, if you have the puck handling to boot. But when we talk about Tarik Parisek, the brain is the attraction. And I think that is an important thing to understand, because if you're watching Parascak play, say you're watching some highlight footage and you're waiting for explosive skating highlights, you're probably going to miss what actually makes him really good. His brain, that hockey IQ, is the attraction. And ultimately why the Capitals took him 17th overall, because we go back to the beginning. He is an Alberta kid born back in 2006. He gets 4 WHL games with Prince George as a 16-year-old in 22-23. But to temper expectations, 4 games, no points. Then what happens? He goes back to Prep Academy. So if you're looking for the obvious top prospect story, this is not it. That there was a whole lot of noise that surrounds him. And then he goes back to Prince George in 23-24 and goes absolutely nuts. 105 points in 68 games, 43 goals, 62 assists. That was good for 8th in the WHL. But here's the part that really caught my attention. That the 105 points were the 4th most by a CHL rookie since 2000-2001. And the guys ahead of him, I'm sure you've probably heard of them, guys like Patrick Kane, Sam Gagner, and Sidney Crosby. Now, I'm not going to go into this with any type of hyperbole. I'm not going to tell you that Tarik Parisek is Sidney Crosby. That's not what this means. To me, it means you're talking about the best rookie seasons in the CHL over that period. Parascak's name is on that list. While I'm not comparing him to those 3 players, I'm also not going to sweep his name under the rug. That is pretty remarkable. And it wasn't like he piled up points on the power play and disappeared the rest of the night. He finished with a plus 49. He was tied for 4th in the WHL in shorthanded goals. Prince George got all the way to the Western Conference Championship, but the hard part for Parascak is he got hurt and missed the final 2 games of that series. But by the end, the breakout had already arrived. That young, promising player had arrived. He was named to the CHL All-Rookie Team. He earned WHL BC Division Second All-Star Team honors. right? And suddenly you're looking at a guy who went from basically an unknown to first round pick in one season, my friends. That is the tagline. That is the story. And why that hockey IQ matters is that when you watch Parascak, I think the first thing you notice is that he doesn't look like a prototypical NHL winger. He is not flying around the outside, winning every foot race or overpowering people. And with him, that is okay because he doesn't really play that way. He reads the ice. He finds open space, gets inside. And one of the things I like the most, he knows where the puck is going before it gets there. And the last part is what I really like there, right? Because sometimes a player looks slow because he is reacting to a play. Parascak can look faster because he is anticipating where that puck is going. And that is a huge difference. He might not beat a defenseman to a spot because he's faster. He gets there because he's figured out where the puck is going first. And that is where that hockey IQ stuff that we talk about becomes so important. And I think it's also why the skating concern is so concerning for me. Because eventually the Capitals, the NHL in general is going to say, okay, that is great. You saw the play. Can you actually get there? And I think that is ultimately the test. And I don't think there's any reason to pretend it's not a concern. It's been a concern. I don't want to turn a blind eye to skating because, well, skating's a pretty big deal. It was the concern when the Capitals drafted him. And it remains the biggest swing skill in his development. If the skating gets good enough, you've got a really interesting offensive player. If it doesn't, however, that can be very concerning. So I don't want to just say that, his skating is not that great, that the hockey IQ is going to make up for the difference. That is what we're betting on. We're hoping that the development in Hershey is going to help fix those problems. But that's the important thing to remember is that we don't need to rush him, right? That we have players on the team, especially young players that are ahead of him. You see Ilya Protas, Ivan Miroshnichenko. You can make an argument for Andrew Crystal that we can take the extra time to see if that skating and all of that catches up to his hockey brain, because the what he has between his ears is what makes him valuable. If he can make up for the deficiencies in other areas like the skating, those kind of things, then I think the Capitals are going to have a truly dynamic player. But it is a waiting game. We don't know at this point if he is, a matter of fact, going to catch up and do that. But I think, like I said, that is what makes his time in Hershey so valuable. So it's one of those things I will be watching in earnest. And of course, I will have you guys caught up here on Locked On Capitals. Does it catch up? Does he show improvements in a full season with the Hershey Bears? So to wrap up segment one, that's why the Caps took the gamble. They weren't drafting a finished player. They were betting on the thing that's hardest to teach: hockey sense. Parascak already had that. He had the production. He had the instincts. He had the ability to find the offense. The question was whether the physical side could catch up. And now we're finally getting to the point where we can start finding out, because the next part of this story gets, well, a lot more complicated. The 105 points didn't happen again. 82 and 79. And that's where people can look at the numbers and say, wait a minute, what is going on here? Well, let's get into that straight ahead right here. Running a business shouldn't feel like you're trying to connect a bunch of systems that were never designed to work together. One app for accounting, another for inventory, another for sales, and somehow none of them talk to each other. That's where Odoo comes in. Odoo is an all-in-one business management software that brings every part of your business together in one powerful platform. From sales and accounting to inventory and marketing, everything works in one place. Odoo is the one platform to manage, grow, and scale your business. The best organizations know that success isn't just about talent, it's about having everyone working toward the same goal. And that's true in sports just like it is in business. One move that really stands out is the Capitals committing to Ryan Leonard, from the front office drafting him 8th overall to the development staff giving him a clear path to Spencer Carberry trusting him with meaningful NHL minutes right away. Everybody was pulling in the same direction. You could see there wasn't any mixed messaging. The organization identified a player they believed could be a part of the next core, and instead of rushing or second-guessing the process, they stayed committed to the plan. That's what alignment looks like, and it's a big reason why Ryan Leonard is such an important part of the Capitals' future and why you need Odoo. So great organizations win because operations matter, and that's why you should get Odoo. Try for free today at odoo.com/lockedon. That's odoo.com/lockedon. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I want to thank you for making this your first listen of the day and for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. So diving into segment 2 here, talking about the 3-year story when it comes to Tarik Parisek, because the biggest takeaway here is this: the box score misses the story. Now, look, I'm not going to sit here and tell you the scoring decline didn't happen. It did. 105 points, then 82, then 79. That is the reality, but I don't think it's fair to look at those numbers and say Parascak got worse every year. That is much too simplistic and not really digging into the decline. And honestly, it is not what happened. Year 2 was still really good. 24-25, Parascak put up 82 points in 59 games. That's still more than a point per game. Among WHL players age 18 or younger, he finished tied for 4th in scoring. So we look at that, right? That is not a bad season. That is a good season, if you ask me. And the league was loaded that year. Andrew Crystal, who's now a part, of course, of the Bears, put up 132 points in 57 games and won the WHL scoring title. That Prince George made it to the playoffs, and Parascak led the Cougars in playoff scoring with 10 points in 7 games. So no, year 2 was not some sort of warning shot. It was just impossible to look at a ridiculous 105 points again. And that's the problem with having a breakout season that big, that everybody expects you to replicate that success again. And of course, that would be nice, but that is not really how things worked. And well, you also got to look at it is that Prince George changed. And the players that surrounded Tarik Parisek, that oftentimes you can put up some of your best numbers because you play with a great supporting cast. See Connor McMichael, when here Luc Dubois. Now, the final junior season is where I think you really have to start paying attention, right? That we need to understand the full story. Parascak finished with 79 points in 61 games, 33 goals, 46 assists, and he led Prince George in regular season in goals and points. But here is what changed. The previous season, 3 players who finished ahead of Parascak in team scoring left, right? All 3 were gone for the 25-26 season. And that is a pretty significant chunk of the offense leaving the building. So Parascak wasn't playing in the same environment and producing less. The environment changed. The lineup changed. His role changed. And he still scored at roughly a point per game pace. So was that season perfect when looking back on it? No. Parascak himself talked about it being up and down. And there were chances that didn't go in, right? Breakaways, good looks, kind of the same stuff that you see on the Capitals players from time to time. Those stretches where you're doing the right thing and the puck just will not go in. And every player, whether you're NHL, juniors, whatever, has been there before. But here is the part that I like. He didn't keep chasing goals. He started putting more emphasis on other things. And what am I talking about? Things that could help the Capitals in the future and, well, the Hershey Bears. Penalty killing, defensive responsibility, playing without the puck, right? Being useful when the points weren't coming. That's something I want to see from a prospect like this, and I expect to see from him in Hershey, because when you get to the NHL, you're not going to score every night. It's just not realistic. You're not even going to get a good scoring chance every night. If you're going to stay in the NHL, you have got to find different ways to help. And Parascak started doing that. And then, well, the playoffs happened, right? And when you really wanted to see what kind of player he was going to be when the pressure went up, he produced. And this is where the proof is in the pudding. This isn't conjecture. You start to see a proof of concept. 17 points in 12 playoff games. He had 3 points in each of his 2 straight playoff wins over Penticton. 6 points across those 2 games. That earned him WHL Player of the Week honors. He wore the alternate captain's letter. And by the end of his junior career, he was sitting second all-time in Prince George franchise scoring with 261 points. Right? That is a pretty good way to finish the story. So again, I don't think the story is what I talked about earlier, 105, then 82 and 79, and what went wrong. I think it is 105, then the environment changed. His responsibilities changed, his game expands, and he still produces. And to me, that is a much more interesting story. And then there's Hershey. And this is another piece of the puzzle that Parascak isn't walking into Hershey this fall having never seen pro hockey. He's already been around the Bears. In 2025, he was loaned to Hershey on April 13th and made his AHL debut on April 19th against Lehigh Valley. One game, that's it. I'm not trying to oversell it here. He didn't suddenly become an AHL veteran because he played one game, but he got the experience. He got to see what that level looked like. Then in 2026, after Prince George season ended, he rejoined Hershey on April 27th during the Bears playoff run. So he's had 2 spring looks at the organization. This fall is different. Now he's going to be there for the full thing, and that is a pretty big deal for Bears fans and bigger picture Capitals fans. So to wrap up segment 2, yes, the numbers went down, fine. I'm not arguing otherwise, but contextual information matters. The supporting cast changed, his role, his game expanded, and Parascak still produced. Now we're done talking about whether he can dominate junior hockey. The question has been answered. The next question is much more difficult. Can he do the same thing in pro hockey? Because this time he's not going back to Prince George. This time Hershey is home. And that's where we're headed, straight ahead. Keep it right here. Support for today's episode comes from Indeed Sponsored Jobs. When workplace chaos hits and you need the right hire, Indeed Sponsored Jobs helps connect employers with candidates who match specific needs like skills, like certifications and location. So spend less time searching and more time spent finding the right fit. People are finding quality hires on Indeed right now. In the minute I've been talking to you, companies like yours made 27 hires on Indeed, according to Indeed data worldwide. And why Indeed is so important. One of the best examples for me is Logan Thompson. He wasn't the biggest acquisition the Capitals made, and nationally it didn't generate a ton of headlines. But he ended up being exactly what the Capitals needed. The Capitals needed stability in net, someone who could handle the workload and give them confidence every night. And well, Thompson delivered. It reminds me that the smartest moves aren't always about landing the biggest name. They're about finding the right fit at the right time. That's what makes Indeed Sponsored Jobs so valuable, helping organizations connect with candidates who fit their needs from the very beginning, and why I think you will love Indeed. So spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Less stress, less time, more results. When you need the right person to cut through the chaos, this is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs, and listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to help your job get the premium status it deserves at Indeed.com/podcast. Just go to Indeed.com/podcast right now and say you heard about this on the Locked On Capitals podcast. Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So in this episode, talking about Tarik Parisek and this season making the pro jump, that he will be playing a full season for Hershey. How will he fare? That the Capitals, like I said in segment one, can afford patience. And I think that that is important because when Parascak goes to Hershey this fall, there's no artificial rush hanging over him that we need him in Washington by X date, right? His entry-level contract slid while he remained in junior hockey. He signed that 3-year entry-level contract on July 5th, 2024. And because of the slide, he's under contract through 2028, 2029. And that is a lot of runway than the original version of the story suggested. So, there were some people like, oh, what are we doing? He doesn't have so much time. You have to factor in the slide rule as well. And I actually think that that is great news, of course, that we don't need to rush Terik. The Caps don't need to force him into the NHL. They don't need to shoehorn him in there. They don't need to decide in October that he's either hit or miss. So I'm not trying to do that. They can develop him, let him play, right? Make mistakes and get stronger. Figure out how to handle pro hockey and then see where he lies. And that is how you should handle a player like this because Hershey is the job. So the question is, what does success look like? Pretty simple. Go to Hershey and become an important player. Not necessarily be the best player on the team, someone who was scoring 50 goals. Just become someone the Bears need. Now, if the 50 goals is a byproduct, that would be great, but I'm not trying to be unrealistic. Get meaningful offensive minutes. Play on the power play. Kill penalties if that's where the opportunities come in. And just learn how to handle a long pro season. And I would say most importantly, improve the skating. We've already established in the show that what's between his ears is legit. Let's improve the skating because that is still the thing. It's still the thing that we're going to be watching going into this season. Everything else is interesting. The hockey IQ, the hands, the instincts, the production, the playoff performances, all of it, right? But can he get around the ice well enough? Because if he checks all of the boxes, but doesn't check the skating box, that still is a cause of concern. And the question, when we evaluate after this coming season, his season in Hershey. But I think the summer work will pay off, and that's where the summer work is worth watching because Parascak was training in Calgary at Duckett Performance Center. He was skating with NHL players including Jake DeBrusk and Morgan Geekie and Dylan Holloway. Now, I like that. I really do. And not because, skating with NHL players magically makes you an NHL player. It doesn't do that. But because Parascak gets to see what that level of hockey looks like, practicing with players cut from that cloth. He gets to feel the pace, gets to see how quickly those guys move, how quickly they progress, and how much stronger they are, and how much little time that actually gives you. That's what's going to be important as well, and that's useful. And he's also been through the Capitals development camp as well, where skating and conditioning are a part of that work. So when we talk about development, we're not guessing what the priority is. The priority is pretty obvious. Close the physical gap. But, to circle back, we do not need to rush him. And here's where I'm going to be pretty firm. I don't want the Caps handling Parascak an NHL job. I don't want them to just say, hey, it's time. Here's your job. I want Parascak taking it. And that, to me, is a big difference. If he comes into camp and forces the issue, great. If he dominates Hershey and gets a call-up because the organization cannot ignore him, well, guess what? Even better. But I don't want to see the Caps rush him because he's a former first-round pick. Let him earn it. And I'm not too concerned. The Capitals have a history of letting guys overcook in some cases. That's how you find out what you actually have. And the contract gives you the luxury of doing just that. There's time. They're going to need it. So what I'm going to watch for Terik and Hershey, for me, the first thing I want to watch is the skating. Does he, as a matter of fact, get to the puck quicker? Is the summer work that he put in helping him? Can he create more separation? Can he get inside against bigger defenders? And can he make the same plays he made in junior when you don't have that extra time, right? When you lose that extra second, can you still close that gap? That is the test. and then watch him on the power play. And that is where I think that hockey IQ is the best chance to show up immediately. If he is finding those soft spots, getting into the slot, right, making those quick plays and creating chances, great. If the skating is also noticeably better, now I'm really interested, because then you start putting the pieces together. So I think the realistic projection, my expectation, Hershey, a legitimate offensive role, a lot of learning, a lot of work. And hopefully by the end of the season, we're talking about a player who looks physically much closer to NHL than he did coming into it. But it's, ultimately up to Terik, right? Maybe he gets a call-up. Maybe he doesn't. And I'm not going to make the call-up the definition of success. That is not the point. The point is development. But remember what made Parascak interesting in the first place. It was not the skating or the physical dominance. It was the brain. He sees things. He anticipates very well and finds the open ice, that he can see where the puck is going before it gets there. You can't teach that stuff very easily. Now the Caps have to make sure his body can keep up with his brain. That is the whole project. So to wrap up the final segment here of today's show, here's where I land with Tarik Parisek. The Capitals have time. The contract gives him runway through 28-29. Parascak has already seen Hershey twice. Now he gets an entire pro season. And the job is, well, rather simple. Get better, stronger, faster, and produce. And make the Caps have to think really hard about whether they can keep you in Hershey, because, again, you don't want the organization handing Parascak an NHL job. You want Parascak making it impossible not to give him one. That is the goal. That is the test. And that is why this season is so darned important. All right, once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, your only daily year-round podcast covering the Capitals. And I want to thank all of you that listen on the audio side and watch this on YouTube. You, my friends, are what makes this show successful. Now on video, we send you to Locked On Sports Today 24/7 YouTube channel. On audio, check out Locked On NHL for your second listen. All right, once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it is your team every day. My name is Dan Holmi, and I'll talk to you again next time.